Hey, biology students, let's talk about protists. What's a protist, you ask? Well, a lot of people who are non-scientists have never even heard of this category of organisms that exist on the planet. So these are organisms within the domain Eukarya. Let's take a look at the pictures on this slide. How about this organism in the far right? Is that a protist? Nope, that's not a protist. That's a mushroom. Mushrooms are fungi. How about these guys? Yes, these are protists. Where would you find them? Well, let's find out. Take a journey with me into nature. Did you know all of that is inside of a drop of pond water? Doesn't it make you want to just go grab a microscope and a drop of some slimy pond water from your backyard and go and look at it to see if you can find some protists? If yes, then maybe you should be a scientist. Okay, guys, so here we are in our biodiversity unit describing in this lecture the very first kingdom that evolved within the domain Eukarya. So I mentioned in the last video that many biologists do not agree what organisms belong in this category or even if we should consider this a kingdom at all. To simplify for our non-majors course, I go ahead and refer to it as one of the four kingdoms within the domain Eukarya. However, there's not that much that unifies this kingdom of organisms. They are very diverse, and we consider them this group of biological misfits because they don't fit well into the three other kingdoms. So what do they have in common? They're all eukaryotes. They got that. Also, in the last video, we talked about endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis is the theory that explains the origin of the eukaryotic cell and all eukaryotic cells going forward in the evolution and history of life. Therefore, these members of Kingdom Protista we consider to be evolutionary precursors. So, following the events of primary and secondary endosymbiosis, these protists would evolve. This grouping of organisms gets very complicated, and if you end up taking a biology for majors course, you will learn more a specific terminology for the way in which we categorize these protists. For simplicity, I am going to categorize them into just three general subcategories within the kingdom Protista that I would like you to explore with me in this lecture. The first are plant-like protists, then fungi-like protists, and animal-like protists. Recall, these are again the precursors that give rise to true plants, true fungi, and true animals. Let's start with plant-like protists. So they're not true plants, but like plants, they photosynthesize. They have chloroplasts, although sometimes these are referred to as plastids. We also use this term to refer to organisms that can photosynthesize by using light energy to make their food. We call them photoautotrophs. That is a term we also use to describe plants. So plants and plant-like protists would be classified as photoautotrophs. Autotroph literally means self-feeder. All plant-like protists live in water, either fresh water or the ocean. They reproduce primarily like bacteria. Remember, bacteria reproduce asexually, a process called binary fission. However, there are some members in the plant-like protist group that can reproduce via sexual reproduction and also with an intermediate stage, a spore stage. It is recognized that this is where the origins of sexual reproduction began. Unlike plants, these protists don't have true roots, stems, or leaves, so they're not categorized in the kingdom Plantae. So in discussing the plant-like protists, I would like to further group them as by their cell structure. So there are some plant-like protists that are single-celled, so their entire body is just one cell or unicellular. And then there are some plant-like protists, their body is composed of many cells. We call that multicellular. Let's talk about the unicellular protist first. Several examples on this slide. Usually in the laboratory component of this course, we look at protists under the microscope so you can get a feel for them. These two are both found in ocean, and they would be categorized as plankton. they have this really interesting crystalline appearance and almost look like Christmas tree ornaments under the microscope. So obviously, because these are single-celled organisms, you need a microscope to see these. So this would be if you took a microscope and a sample of ocean water and looked under the microscope. So the bottom picture, we call these diatoms. And this glowing single-celled organisms, these are called dinoflagellates. These are really cool because they undergo a process called bioluminescence in the oceans. And on certain times of the year, they proliferate to high numbers, where if you go out into the ocean, especially at night, you will see them glow. And they glow by when you move the ocean water. So they light up in response to motion in the water. Here's a picture of a woman in the ocean here, just waving her hands around, and you see this fluorescent glow follow the movement of her arms. And that would be this bioluminescence, which is a unique trait of this group, which is recognized to likely be a mechanism of defense against predators. Also within the group of unicellular plant-like protists, we have unicellular algae. So notice that these are green in appearance, and the explanation would be the chloroplast with chlorophyll as the primary pigment that reflects the green light and gives these single-celled organisms a green appearance under the microscope. Next, multicellular plant-like protists. A lot of students will tell me that seaweed and kelp are plants, and that is incorrect. Seaweed or giant kelp, which is a type of brown algae, is actually a multicellular plant-like protist. The reason why it's not a plant, it doesn't have true roots, stems, or leaves. So it's categorized again in the misfit group into the kingdom Protista. There's also multicellular green algae. This is also edible. Now, what you're seeing here, the nori that you might eat or wrap your sushi in, is actually a group of red algae. So there's also red algae that's multicellular protist, and it may or may not appear red. This one under the ocean, you can see it definitely is red, and that's because although it does photosynthesize, it photosynthesizes using different pigments that reflect red light instead of green. And so that's because those pigments absorb a different wavelength of light. Usually that's because these red algae live deeper in the ocean where there's less light available. And so they absorb at a different wavelength of light in the spectrum of light. Next, we're going to talk about the animal-like protists. We'll go back in time and tell you the story of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, the Dutch scientist who is the first person to observe these microorganisms using a very simple one-lens microscope. Here you can see him in the picture looking through this very simple one-lens, very primitive microscope, and drawing what he saw in his laboratory notebook, and he labels them figure A and B and all of this over here, and you see these long or dot-like structures. Basically what he saw, he took a drop of pond water just like I showed you in the beginning of this lecture, and he saw a lot of single-celled life forms swimming around, chasing each other, eating each other, and he stumbled upon a microscopic safari that exists in water. This was big news. Notice here we are in the 1600s. This was big news, but it would be about 200 years even after Leeuwenhoek when people would finally realize that some of these microorganisms were germs, and germs can cause disease. So obviously now we know we can't just drink any old fresh water that you find in nature. Not a good idea because of these microscopic protists, as well as bacteria that reside in water and many of which are parasitic. So, what are some features of the animal-like protists? Well, they do move around quite a bit. So, lots of movement strategies. I'm just going to mute that actually, but we can see that movement here. Again, in a drop of pond water. In a minute here, we're going to describe some of these different strategies of movement that are common to the animal-like protists. So one thing you'll notice is they're all unicellular. They're classified as heterotrophs. So that word means to feed on others. So they feed on others, not photosynthetic. They live in water, although many live inside of animals and exist as parasites. So Anton van Leeuwenhoek, this Dutch scientist, he actually describes these organisms he sees in pond water as protozoa is the word he uses. That word means first animal. And that's because he really observed what he thought was animal-like behavior in these microorganisms. And he was very entertained for many hours watching them under the microscope. He was an interesting guy. The story goes he also looked at some of his own blood under the microscope to observe his red blood cells, and he also looked at some of his own sperm under the microscope, which, by the way, animal sperm, human sperm, looks a lot like these protists. Why do you think that would be? It's because these protists are the evolutionary precursors of all animals. And so animals, as well as actually plants, have flagellated sperm. So flagella is one of the mechanisms of movement that these protozoans use. Let's take a look at those there's three general types of movement that are recognized for the protozoans. And I've got these animated videos to go with it as well. So here we're looking at an organism here called paramecium. You see that word pop up there on the slide. It's a very common pond water microorganism, very common. And if you take a close look, and I've also got it over here on the side, we're looking at these little hairs around the surface of the cell. And these little hairs are called cilia. The purpose of these little hairs is movement. Once again, because these organisms are the precursors of all animals, if that's true, there should be evidence within your own body of ancestry, of common ancestry with protists like these. So, do you know of any cells in your body that are ciliated, that have cilia, like these paramecium cells? Now, of course, we are multicellular animals. So our bodies are composed of trillions of cells and cells that organize into tissues and into body systems with an organized purpose. However, There are cells in our body that are ciliated. The cells that line your respiratory system, your windpipe, called the trachea. It's composed of ciliated cells. These little cells in your respiratory system beat like little hairs, just like you're seeing here with these paramecium. The purpose of the ciliated cells of your respiratory system is to prevent harmful microorganisms from getting into your lungs. And so these little finger-like hair structures along your ciliated trachea, they beat rhythmically and capture this dust and debris and pathogens that we constantly breathe in from the environment. Females, your reproductive tract, your fallopian tubes, are lined with ciliated cells that look just like these protists. And for female animals that ovulate or release an egg from their ovaries once a month during the ovulation stage of their menstrual cycle, that egg will be released into the fallopian tube, and those ciliated cells that line the fallopian tube will once again act like little fingers that push the egg through the fallopian tube and allow for, if that egg gets fertilized by a sperm, pushes the fertilized embryo into the uterus where the embryo implants. The point of that story is again to demonstrate a very strong piece of evidence that supports theory of evolution and theory of evolution by common ancestry, that all life on this planet has a common root, a common ancestry, and we share traits even with the simplest of organisms. And that is true with these ciliated cells. Let's take a look at another mechanism of protist movement. I love this video. It is like watching the National Geographic Channel where, the lion hunts down the gazelle and, rips it apart, and it's all very dramatic and wild, right? Well, this is that same concept of predator chasing prey, eating prey, devouring prey alive, but it's at the microscopic level. So you need a microscope to see this. But once again, demonstrating animal behavior. There's a reason why we call the organisms in this group the animal-like protists or the protozoans. They definitely demonstrate some animal-like behavior, predator and prey. So here we're seeing the amoeba, which is pictured here, also on the slide, is oozing towards its prey, engulfs these two paramecia. We just met the paramecia on the previous slide, right? And engulfs them alive. The paramecium eventually here, they're realizing their lunch. They can't escape. They're trapped inside of the amoeba. And you know what? They're being digested alive with specialized digestive enzymes inside of that amoeba cell. What does this process remind you of? That's right. It should remind you of endosymbiosis, which was covered in the last video. Remember, we learned about an event that occurred just like this that you just observed, but the event we're describing occurred 1.5 billion years ago, and that was primary endosymbiosis. That was the engulfment of a bacterial cell by a primitive eukaryote. And I told you in that video that this process of engulfment, or what's called endocytosis, is actually very common among heterotrophic microorganisms. Is there a cell in our body that acts like this? Well, I showed you in the endosymbiosis lecture. Your white blood cells. So your white blood cells act like amoebas. They seek out infectious microorganisms that invade your body, and you know what? They just eat them. We call them phagocytes, which means big eaters. Okay, so let's label this guy on the slide. This is an amoeba. That's the name of the organism. And his method of movement we call pseudopodia. Sometimes pseudopodia is also referred to as cytoplasmic streaming. Once again, it's that oozing movement. Let's watch this video again. So cool. So it's that oozing movement of the amoeba towards its prey, because remember, it's a heterotroph. Hetero means to eat others. Heterotroph. So it's eating these paramecia cells, engulfing them, and digesting them. This is not going to become a symbiotic relationship like the ancestral cells back during the time of endosymbiosis. Pseudopodia, by the way, that means fake feet. So pseudo means fake and pod means foot. Really, amoebas don't have a defined shape. So they have these projections of cytoplasm that sort of resemble feet. So this would be a little pseudopod, and this would be a little pseudopod. Fake feet, pseudopods. Lastly, let's look at flagella. So you see this little tail on this protozoan? I outlined it so we could look at it. This would be called a flagellum, is singular. Flagella is plural. This here is actually a parasitic protozoan that's called Trichomonas, and it causes a sexually transmitted infection called trichomoniasis. So this organism lives primarily in the either in the urethra of men or in the vagina for women who become infected via sexual intercourse. Anyways, they're flagellated. You could see here they're swimming around, and a lot of times it's hard to see flagella because it's such a thin protein tail that these single-celled organisms have, but there you go. This is an example of a protozoan, and it's called Trichomonas. Okay, this brings us to our last group of protists, the third group, the fungus-like protists, or the fungi-like protists. Okay, so we haven't covered fungi yet. That'll be my next video. So they are a lot like fungi. They are heterotrophic decomposers. Once again, feeding on others primarily as a decomposition role in the environment. So they live in water or they live on decaying organic matter. They're all multicellular. They're not photosynthetic. However, although there's a lot of things in common with the fungi there, one of the major reasons why we don't put them in the kingdom fungi is that they do have an amoeba-like stage of their life cycle. So they do seem to share closer evolutionary relationships with the protozoans. So pictured here on the slide, we have a water mold. And we have a slime mold. You could tell the slime mold here, it's in pink, cool color. Pink, bright pink is its natural color, and it's parasitic on plants while acting as a decomposer, so on dead or decaying material. So that's it for the protists. I hope that was enlightening. And as far as what you need to know, as far as the details regarding this very unusual, somewhat kingdom, please refer to your study guide as well. Talk to you next time.